COP26. I'd like to introduce you to Kaveh Gillenpour. He is the Vice President for International Strategies at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions.
Much and good evening everyone here in Glasgow and also at home wherever you are in the world. It's really a pleasure to have you here. CTUS is working very closely with EDF on a project to elaborate and to offer thought leadership on how the global stocktake process under the UNFCCC could be most effective to raise ambition. That's the process under the Paris Agreement that every 5 years is supposed to inform parties and also non-party stakeholders on how to raise ambition in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we're really privileged to be welcomed or joined here today by thought leaders both in person and also online who are working in this particular area. So in the order of speakers, we have Kate Larson, who's a director at Rhodium Group and leads the firm's Climate Desk Data Service and international climate policy research. She specializes in analysis of the impacts of clean energy policy on the US and international greenhouse gas emissions and strategies for decarbonizing the global economy. And prior to joining Rhodium, Kate served as Deputy Director for Energy and Climate Change at the White House Council on Environmental Quality under President Obama, and she also previously served as a US climate negotiator, so she should really be back here leading the effort on the negotiations. Kishan Kumar Singh is the head of the Multilateral Environment Agreements Unit at the Ministry of Planning and Development and has been Trinidad and Tobago's lead technical negotiator under the UNFCCC for more than 20 years, and he has also many years of experience of chairing key groups under the climate negotiations here. Dean Bielek is the head of International Politics Unit at COP26 Climate Champions Team. Dean's a leading international lawyer and diplomat and expert on energy, climate change and sustainable development. And after 6 years as an Australian diplomat, including representing Australia at the UN in New York, Dean worked as lead negotiator and legal advisor to the world's island states, in particular the Marshall Islands and the High Ambition Coalition that the US rejoined only today in 2015. And he also helped to draft many of the Paris Agreement's key provisions, including on the 5-year cycle that I actually worked very closely with Dean on. And last but not least, Lavanya Rajamani is a professor of international environment law at the University of Oxford, specializing in international climate change law. And she also serves as coordinating lead author on the IPCC's 6th assessment report. So with that, I'd like to kick off by handing over to Kate. So Kate, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kaveh. I'm happy to be here virtually. I wanted to start off by doing a little mini stock take of our own, getting a sense of what the pledges that have been made to date have achieved and what that means compared to what science requires. Let's do the first slide, please. So, and then the next slide. I want to start with a little bit of good news. I feel like we could all use a little bit of that right now. In 2014, the year before the Paris Agreement was adopted, the world was on track for a pretty rapid rise in greenhouse gas emissions, growing at about 1.6% per year on average through 2030, reaching over 60 gigatons in 2030 and over 70 in 2040. So we've really achieved a slight bend in the curve, as you can see from that starting point, with the pledges that have been adopted to date. And I'm including here a wide range of different country level pledges, including the NDCs, but also the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, phasing down HFC emissions, and also the Global Methane Pledge that was announced today. All three of those commitments are important components of the global outlook, and those really help, as you can see, reduce the growth in emissions over time. But if we just look at those commitments on a 2030 timeframe, as we can see, it really just helps to flatten out emissions through the next couple of decades. A significant reduction from where we were before the Paris Agreement. And a lot of this was achieved both by some changes in outlook for economic growth, but largely through reduction in the carbon and energy intensity of our energy systems. And that was done, really achieved by a wide range of different countries. developing, all of them played a role in reducing the expectations of emissions growth over time. Next slide. This really translates into some pretty important reductions in expectations for temperature rise over time. Before Paris, we were on track for around 4.6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, including the current pledges, so the NDC's Kigali and the global methane goal. That really bends that curve down. I think, median estimates of temperature rise expectations under the current pledges, and again, this does not include the net zero pledges, brings that down to around 2.7 degrees Celsius. Important to note here that every fraction of a degree counts. We want to get down well below 2 degrees Celsius, but if you think about the change in outlook from pre-Paris to today, that's a significant reduction in terms of the natural and human impacts. I think one estimate by the Climate Impact Lab has that just heat-related mortality deaths, so just deaths from heat, would be reduced by 150 million over that time period. So really important to acknowledge the progress that we've made so far. Next slide. When you add in the net zero pledges that many countries have taken, and there have been recent developments, additions to this list that I didn't include, but those are also important to help see how the curve gets bent even further beyond 2030. But as you can see, it still doesn't get to where we need to be by mid-century. We are maybe about halfway to where we need to be. This really helps us, I think, to focus on what we need to do in the next few years between now and 2030. First, we need to get more countries on board for net zero targets in the mid-century timeframe. So bending that yellow curve down to zero as close as possible by mid-century. Then the green line also needs to come down. That means we need to continue to push for additional ambition in the 2030 timeline so that countries are on track for those net zero goals. That means ensuring the implementation of those pledges happen, but also continuing to increase the ambition of those pledges, because if on our current track, we're really leaving a lot of the hard work for the following decades, and we need to do as much as we can now. And largely that's decarbonizing the electric power sector, beginning to convert end-use technologies like vehicles, buildings, and some industry to electrify, so that those physical resources aren't locking in high-emitting fossil consumption over time. So really, I think importance here is continuing to bend both that green current pledges curve and the yellow curve down over time. Next slide, please. Again, really bringing back the focus on 2030. Here's the difference between the expectations in terms of global emissions from before Paris was adopted and the current commitments that are on the table today, using the IPCC and other benchmarks for what is needed to stay on track for 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, or a good chance of keeping temperature rise below those levels. We're off, the gap is about 10 to 15 gigatons to get below 2 degrees, and nearly 25 gigatons to get below 1.5 degrees. So that's on top of the pledges, the national pledges that have been made today. And I should say a lot of corporate commitments have also been made that aren't counted here, and we see those as being critical to helping countries get on track for the pledges that they've made to date. And I just want to say quickly that there's a lot of great new information that can help us provide the data and information that we need to continue this kind of stock taking of where we are and what more we need to do. The Paris framework provides important reporting and information from countries that help us assess whether or not they're on track to meet their pledges. New satellite data tracking forest cover loss, methane plumes, all of that will be incredibly useful to get a sense of what we're doing. Groups like ours, like the Rhodium Group, are taking all of that data information and putting it together into a methodologically consistent set of baselines for all countries in the world, so that we can have some consistent data and information to inform the global stocktake and other exercises to track our progress. And again, I should say, important not only to track the outlook for emissions, but are we on track to deploy the types of technologies we will need? the emerging technologies like sustainable aviation fuels, direct air capture, green hydrogen. Are we investing in those technologies at scale that will really drive the outlook for emissions over time? So tracking both the policy commitments, the implementation of those commitments, and also the technology deployment and financing for those commitments. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'll hand it back over to you, Kaveh.
It's really nice to see your face back here in the US Pavilion where you belong. If I may, just to ask you a quick follow-up, I mean, it's really fantastic work that you're doing there at Rhodium. I mean, first of all, what would be helpful for you to see from the global stocktake as a process and as an output that would sort of help you with your work? And also, are there sectors that you think really need to be focused on during that 2023, 2025 period that would help bend the curve in the way that you said? Thank you.
Yeah, there's modeling has come a long way, and as I said, the data inputs are improving over time, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. So I think important to understand and be honest about the uncertainty in modeling. I think there are some sectors that are very well characterized. We know a lot about the energy sector and what it will require. We know less about agriculture, forests, land use. Those are the areas where there needs to be more work to have better information, and a better information on the timescales, the annual timescales that we need. So I would love to see from the global stocktake the combination of pledges and targets with actual implementation, so we have better view on what actions are being taken and how that translates into an overall outlook for each country. And as well as the technology deployment. So I think all of those pieces are really critical to understand, and we hope that this is a driver for new and better information, collecting all of that great satellite data that's out there to use it to inform ways to make this easier so that all countries are rowing in the same direction.
Thanks a lot, Kate. Really appreciate it. Hopefully you can stay with us until the end. So turning now to Kishan. I mean, Kishan, for many years you've been negotiating on behalf of the small island states who were very largely responsible for the 1.5 limit in the Paris Agreement, but also the ambition mechanism. I mean, what would you, from your perspective, what would you like to see from the global stocktake? And your experience of chairing in this process as well, how could that process be effective in actually delivering implementation and not just to be a process that results in an empty outcome?
Yep. Thank you, Kaveh, and thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to be part of this this panel. Perhaps I could respond by looking at a historical perspective of how this regime has evolved, starting, of course, with the UN General Assembly resolution to negotiate a framework convention, and how small islands were reflected in that convention under Article 4.8 and 4.9 as particularly vulnerable. The provisions of the convention themselves were not adequate, as was quickly recognized at the first conference of the parties, and then we had the negotiations with the Kyoto Protocol. And beyond that, we reached the Paris Agreement. So for the first time in the global climate regime, we now have an instrument that requires action by every country. Whether you're a large advanced developed country or a small island least developed state, every country now has to provide some kind of contribution to the NDC for achieving the temperature goal. So through that evolution, we have seen more and more certainty being built into what needs to be done, from the aspirational, undefined goal of the convention itself to now a temperature goal of the Paris Agreement as an ultimate objective of the Paris Agreement. We have now seen that the science, the policy perspective have all included the necessary sort of action items that are required, albeit enshrined in different instruments. And so we are at the stage now where, as Kate said, and I think very elegantly illustrated in her presentations, the science is now there, the models are now there, the projections are now there, the latest IPCC report collates all of this research that was not there before. So there's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of scientific evidence now at our disposal and increasing and expanding as we go forward. The IPCC report on 1.5 was particularly instructive for small island states. And if I were to just draw on one aspect of it, where coral reefs, which is abundant in small island states, at a 1.5 warming, between 78 and 90% will be lost. And with that goes coastal erosion, coastal protection, fisheries, habitats, tourism products, and so on. But at 2 degrees, virtually all will be decimated, more than 99%. So I think that small rise in temperature itself and the impacts as have been reported in the IPCC report itself is telling for the impacts and the potential impacts it can have on small island states. What the global stocktake does, I think it's a critically important part of the Paris Agreement provisions, because what it does is that it provides a series of milestones, of course, but what is the meaning of those milestones? In my view, they are quality control or quality assurance checks on what is being done. For the first time, we have this now multilateral checkpoint that is geared to tell us whether we are on track or whether we are not on track. So it's in itself a bit of an early warning system, and that is critically important for vulnerable countries like small island states as to what more is required. So that the science is there. What we now need to inform the global stocktake, I mean, that conversation has already started in terms of what information will be required for populating the global stocktake. Beyond that, what is required, notwithstanding the uncertainty, and I think Kate mentioned that, what more is required is the political will to act on the outcomes of the global stocktake and to act in time. Because if the gap remains, if there are significant gaps that would still take us to beyond the 1.5, which will spell doom and gloom, I think, for small island states, based on what I just said, it will make living, even existing in those island states, very, very difficult, if possible at all. So the global stocktake for us, and I speak collectively, at least for us in Trinidad and Tobago, punctuates the process in significant ways. But I think more than that, the first global stocktake is perhaps critically important, because that gives us a sort of a synoptic view of where we are going and where we need to go. But again, as with everything else, the value of the stocktake is only as good as to what use it is put to. And therefore, critically, growing political will needs to be demonstrated so that the next round of NDCs, for example, you've seen updates from NDCs, from countries for NDCs, it still falls short. And hopefully the global stocktake will provide the impetus for showing exactly where we are, what we need to do. So it's a bit of an early warning system, like I said. The technology is there, it's evolving. The science is there, it's evolving. So I think everything is in place to inform the global stocktake, but more than that, for the global stocktake itself to inform what needs to be done. And for the global stocktake, it's like a model, if you want. What goes in determines what comes out. And therefore, what goes in needs to be transparent, has to be honest, has to be able to withstand robust scrutiny, and therefore part of the outcomes of this COP in terms of the transparency framework and all of the other mechanisms that go towards mitigation need to be robust enough so that accountability can be had. And therefore that accountability, notwithstanding the science, notwithstanding the technology, still has to be informed by increased political ambition. We've heard about adaptation ambition, mitigation ambition, financial ambition. It has to be informed by political ambition going forward. And that is the only ambition, in my view, that has to be sustained, because that is what informs all of the other pieces of the ambition puzzle. So therefore, in summary, the global stocktake really is a significant part of the Paris Agreement architecture, but the first one is it has particular significance because it then informs where we are, and that would itself inform the rest of the global stocktakes that will come every 5 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Kishan. You actually answered one of the questions I was going to ask you, which was about the importance of the transparency regime and, of course, the negotiations that are ongoing. Maybe I can ask you another one. I mean, you also mentioned the importance of maintaining political momentum, and of course you'll recall, because you were involved in those negotiations, that the Katowice decision that set out the guidance for the global stocktake invites the Secretary General to host a summit of world leaders in 2023, and I think the Secretary General followed that up with a commitment in his Common Agenda report that he produced. How important do you think that sort of convening of world leaders is to maintain ambition? I mean, we've seen evidence of it yesterday and today. Do you think that will be an important milestone in the GST process if he convenes the world leaders?
No, I think absolutely. After all, leaders are the ones who set the political agenda for their countries. And that is one way of maintaining that political momentum. It's one way of maintaining climate change on the top of the agenda. But it's also one way of getting commitments to adhere to the outcomes of the GST, to adhere to the provisions of the Paris Agreement for incremental ambition, to adhere to increasing NDC ambition going forward. And therefore, continuous engagement at the highest political level is a critical part. We've seen and we've heard the various statements of leaders at this conference that, that part that ends today. And I think without exception, we have seen a recommitment to doing something about climate change. Of course, notwithstanding that they have varied pieces of ambition, but they're all looking in the same direction, which I think is a very critical part of that chorus line that is required from world leaders to sing from the same hymn book towards continued ambition.
Well, I was lucky enough to be with Kishan today when he was listening to his Prime Minister delivering the speech that Kishan had a big part in writing. So we look forward to this speech in 2023. And Kishan, you've left a room full of negotiators that you're chairing to come and join us. So you'll have to leave shortly, but thank you very much for being here. So I'm turning now to Dean, who's working closely with the Climate Champions team. But Dean was also very closely involved both with the inclusion of the 1.5 limit in the Paris Agreement, the calling for the IPCC special report on 1.5. We both negotiated together over a number of years, the 5-year cycle. But Dean, I mean, you're now involved in the action side of things, and this is a COP that's really marks in a way a transition from negotiation to implementation. And the Climate Champions, both Nigel and Gonzalo, have really done more than any to bring the action agenda forward. And as you heard Kate mentioned earlier, the importance of implementation. So what are the champions doing in this area and the action agenda, and how can that link to the global stocktake in future?
All right, thanks, Kaveh, and I'd like to reiterate Kishan's thanks to you and to C2ES and the US Pavilion, or Centre I should call it, for hosting. And it's great to be on this panel with some very good friends and colleagues, all of whom were great collaborators and still very dedicated to the task of a safe climate future. So, as you said, my experience in the UNFCCC has largely been through the lens of the hot and sweaty negotiating rooms. But over the last 18 months, my work has really pivoted to the world of what we call in the Climate Champions team the real economy. So the corporations, the investors, the subnational governments, the universities and other actors that together represent the economic systems and sectors that drive the global economy. It's important to recall where this area of work came from, and Lavanya will recall very clearly those high-pressured rooms in Durban when attached to the delivery of the Durban mandate for the negotiation of a new instrument under the UNFCCC. Alongside that was a decision to launch a new work stream called Workstream 2 in the ADP, and that was intended really to shake things up and offer an innovative space which brought in line ministers, which brought in international organisations and experts to have more in-depth conversations about how best to remove obstacles to further ambition and action in the real economy. And I think what you're seeing now at this COP, as you were saying, is a real delivery on that early intention to open up the negotiations to the real world. And I think it's fantastic. Over the last 2 years, and we've had the benefit, so to speak, of the delay obviously in the COP, but that's really allowed us in the Climate Champions team to gather a head of steam and some momentum. We have 3 overarching campaigns to gather up commitments from the non-state actor sphere. The first is the Race to Zero for reducing emissions, the Race to Resilience for driving climate-ready infrastructure and built environments, and the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, which we've worked together with Mark Carney on, for shifting the trillions of dollars of capital investment that will be required to remake our world into a safer, healthier and more sustainable planet. And through these campaigns, we're seeking to ensure that real action, ingenuity and inventiveness of the private sector and subnational leadership gets the recognition it deserves, and also that we only give credit where credit is due. So a big aspect for us is to ensure the credibility of the commitments, and over the last 12 months we've made great grounds in enhancing the strictness and the robustness of our criteria, which apply to anyone who is seeking to join the platforms and campaigns. And we're doing that with the input of a lot of technical experts under the supervision of Oxford University. So it's called our Criteria 2.0. To give you an idea of the scale of our progress over the last 18 months, we announced today that Race to Zero's membership has grown to more than 7,000 different entities, more than 5,000 businesses, 67 regions, 1,000 cities, 441 financial institutions with more than 100 trillion in assets under management, about 1,000 universities and 52 healthcare institutions. Just a few numbers for you. But I think, as you were saying before, at this COP, it is really difficult not to conclude that the artist formerly known as Workstream 2, now rebranded as the Marrakesh Partnership, has finally come of age. So as one example, this morning, we saw the wonderful Selena Leem, a grassroots youth activist from the Marshall Islands, take the stage alongside Bank of America's CEO Brian Moynihan to describe new collaborative initiatives to reduce emissions, enhance resilience and regenerate nature. And Bank of America announced this morning a new finance vehicle to build 8 gigawatts of new wind, solar and EV charging in the Caribbean. So it's huge news. I wanted to reflect very quickly on what's unique here about the area of work that we're doing and why it's relevant for the stocktake. We say that our work is trying to leverage what we call the ambition loop. And to explain, action from non-state actors creates more political space and acceptance within national governments, allowing them to feel more comfortable to bring forward more ambitious targets or NDCs and other commitments. And from the business and non-state actor side, they need the confidence from government that ambitious targets will be set and adhered to, and that the right policies, incentives will be there, and that new markets will be created for clean green industries. So the mandate for the work under the Marrakesh Partnership is very simple. It's aimed at enhancing ambition across the 3 main pillars under the Paris Agreement. This aligns very closely with what the global stocktake intends to achieve. In essence, a critical moment in each 5-yearly update cycle to assess progress, but to do so not for no reason, but to help establish a factual basis for informing and enhancing ambition. So very quickly, to get to the kind of real nub of your questions, I think there are 3 main areas where our work could potentially be taken up by parties in considering what are the valid and important inputs to the global stocktake process. So one is which was included in the mandate from COP25, alongside the 5-year extension of the mandate of the champions, for the Global Climate Action Portal to track progress of voluntary non-state actor commitments. That was originally in Paris referred to as NASCAR, as you'll recall. The key institutional mechanism we have for that is called CAMDA, and that will be relaunched in a second phase of work on the 6th of November at an open event titled Tracking Credible Climate Action. And so that will work on methodologies for data collection and analyses, determining metrics for progress and ambition, and aggregating verified data into public reports and analyses, which could very nicely feed into the stocktake if parties decided to do so. The second potential source is the Yearbook of Global Climate Action, which was an idea launched at COP22 in Marrakesh, essentially an annual compilation of non-state actor climate action and initiatives, and this year will be released at the High-Level Champions mandated event on Thursday the 11th of November. Third, I wanted to mention is the newest potential source of information from our area of work is the Breakthrough Agenda launched by Prime Minister Boris Johnson together with 8 other heads of state, and now with initial and very broad support, surprisingly to me actually, from 80 countries for an initial set of Glasgow breakthroughs in 5 hard-to-abate sectors and areas of emerging technology: power, transport, steel, green hydrogen and nature-based solutions. Importantly, the declaration put out today tasks the IEA as lead, together with IRENA and the high-level champions, to monitor and report on progress in each of these breakthrough sectors and identify how collaboration can accelerate progress. So one could see the potential to look at how the ambition loop I referred to it earlier is providing opportunities for greater national ambition as one of the outputs from the stocktake. So we'll be watching carefully parties' deliberations on the inputs and process for the stocktake, and we're available obviously to contribute to that process through the outputs I've mentioned.
Thanks a lot, Dean. Just a very quick question as a follow-up. So, you mentioned Workstream 2, which was really that you were involved in setting that up in Durban, the mandate there. It was the launch of the action agenda, or the precursor of that. So, would you say, you mentioned there that the announcement that was made today had an unprecedented level of support from parties. Would you say that you're getting signals that parties would be willing to have more openness? At the end, negotiators are the gatekeepers of what comes into and out of the global stocktake. Do you think there's a willingness more than there was in the past to have non-parties to input and influence the global stocktake?
Look, if you take as a litmus test what we've seen over the first 2 days, you can't escape the conclusion that non-state actor engagement in the process is an idea whose moment has come. It's taken 10 years to get there, so Durban mandates 10 years ago almost to the day, but I think it's, as I said, an inescapable conclusion. What's important is, one, we ensure that the commitments that are made in the non-state actor community have a credibility that doesn't undermine at the other end once it's inputted into a process and then it's called into question. That would be a very dangerous area to get into. And secondly, I think we're at the point now where there's an increasing openness to look at the global climate effort in a sectoral way. And that's very much the basis of our work. It has traditionally been resisted in the UNFCCC regime, and no doubt there will continue to be signals in that direction. But I think given the engagement at the highest levels of government over these 2 days, we're on the right track.
It's really helpful. Thanks a lot, Dean. Really positive ideas, and thanks for making me feel 10 years older by reminding me how long ago Durban was. So if we could turn to you, Lavanya. So you have extensive experience, like all of our guests today, on the UNFCCC process. What do you, particularly from your legal perspective, and I know that you've advised the presidencies in the past and also the Secretariat, what do you see as the limitations and opportunities of the GST, and how can we really make that more effective? For example, to take on board non-parties and maybe to have that sectoral approach that Dean mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveh. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be part of this panel with old friends, colleagues, and fellow climate warriors, really. The global stocktake's potential in terms of what it can deliver and its limitations are fundamentally determined by the nature of the UN negotiating process and the dynamic that it is a creature of. So there is a risk, given the negotiating dynamics, that the global stocktake, like other review processes under the UNFCCC, like the Talanoa dialogue, for instance, will become a fairly mundane checkbox exercise, and that it will do little more than state the patently obvious, that although we might be doing better than we were pre-Paris, we're still not on track to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that's the case not just with temperature rise, but also in relation to adaptation and support as well. And there is a risk that the output will be nothing more than an exhortation to states to do more, to get on track. This is not where the value add of the global stocktake is. We need the global stocktake to tell us something we do not already know. We already know we're not on track and the consequences are dire. And there are a series of reports that have done this for us and will continue to do this for us in the run-up to the global stocktake in 2023. Reference has already been made. Kishan raises the special report, the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees centigrade, played a very critical role in alerting us to the directions that we're, pathway that we're on and the consequences of that pathway, the difference between well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. The IPCC's Working Group 1 report in August, and of course, the Working Group 2 and 3 reports that will come out next year, the UNEP GAP reports, the 2021 report most recently, the NDC's synthesis report, all of these tell us that we're not on track. So the global stocktake has to do more than synthesize just information from these. So to answer your question, how it could be effective in facilitating enhanced ambition beyond COP26, to actually be a true moment of reckoning for the international community on climate change, I think needs to focus on two things, in my view. First, the reckoning, international reckoning, a moment of reckoning for the international community on climate change should be a cohesive one, should be a comprehensive one, and it should be set to updated benchmarks. I will come back to this in a minute. The second, I think, second ask of the global stocktake is that it should result in not just in a declaration or decision, which is what is expected from the global stocktake, but it should actually identify opportunities for states and non-state actors, as Dean has just been illustrating for us, create opportunities or identify opportunities for multiple stakeholders to take practical, scalable options across sectors to collectively meet these updated benchmarks that we're talking about. The output should be usable. And I agree with Kishan, it should certainly be usable, but to pick up on what Dean was saying, it should be usable not just by states, but also by non-state actors, by multiple stakeholders. Coming back to the first point that I made, that the reckoning should be cohesive and comprehensive and one set to updated benchmarks. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this because this is perhaps the more provocative one, especially for negotiators. Now, Article 14 tells us the global stocktake should be conducted in a comprehensive manner, and it should be conducted in the light of equity and the best available science. Now, these terms, comprehensive, equity, best available science, are open texture terms that function, in my view and interpretation, as hooks for expanding and deepening the inquiry the global stocktake is engaged in. These hooks could be used to actually construct the global stocktake as an occasion to demand true environmental effectiveness, which goes well beyond the institutional effectiveness. And by institutional effectiveness, I mean effectiveness of just the Paris Agreement processes and the logic of the Paris Agreement, but look beyond that to environmental effectiveness. Environmental effectiveness, are we actually resolving the problem that we set out to resolve? Are we addressing the climate crisis in the most comprehensive and cohesive way? This will take us beyond, or at least stretch the interpretations of the clear terms of what we agreed to. But I think in light of the hooks that we have, that this should be a comprehensive exercise, and the fact that it should be cohesive, suggests that we have some potential for going beyond just institutional effectiveness in the global stocktake. We need this to be responsive to the evolving science. which means that the goals that we've identified for ourselves, the purpose and goals of the Paris Agreement, well below 2 degrees, at least in relation to temperature, and 1.5 degrees, we can actually stretch the purpose and the goals of the Paris Agreement towards 1.5 rather than just well below 2 degrees in the light of several scientific reports that have come out. Also in the light of the diplomacy of ambition that has evolved, the political will that we're seeing exhibited, and we've seen in the last couple of days in particular. We have seen, for instance, that the conversation has moved beyond 2015 and the Paris Agreement in many respects. For instance, in relation to the net zero goals. Article 4.1 talks about reaching net zero in the second half of the century. We have seen it move to mid-century thanks to the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees. There are calls for the long-term temperature goal to move accordingly towards 1.5 degrees rather than well below 2 degrees. And even for the nationally determined contributions to be updated more frequently than every 5 years. There are calls for finance. So this goes beyond temperature and mitigation ambition. There are calls for finance that is currently on the table to be scaled up to support just transitions in developing countries. The science on attribution has evolved on unfair shares of states. All this is not to suggest that we renegotiate the Paris Agreement, but that when we take stock of progress towards achieving the purpose and goals of the Paris Agreement, we recognize that for this to be a truly comprehensive and cohesive exercise, the purpose and goals are not static and set in stone, but are also continually evolving in response to the science, in response to the scholarship, and in response to the diplomacy of ambition, including on net zero. We can use the global stocktake to go beyond. We can use the global stocktake, for instance, to integrate this wider landscape of ambition and diplomacy of ambition and evolving science into the UN negotiating process. So, for example, in the way that the champions are seeking in their campaign on Race to Zero to build in credibility and accountability for net zero targets, we can find hooks within the global stocktake process to actually instill some element of credibility and accountability into the net zero goals that states have taken on for themselves. Are we just postponing difficult decisions and actions to later years? As Kate pointed out, much of the hard work has been left for future decades. I'm aware that some of these sort of purpose and goals, at least some aspects of it, like for instance, the long-term temperature goal is being reviewed in the periodic review, but the global stocktake needs to be cohesive. And this entire process needs to be less fragmented in relation to taking stock of the purpose and goals of the Paris Agreement. It is also, of course, worth reiterating that the goals and purpose go well beyond the temperature goal, and these two are evolving. So the second element that I highlighted in terms of making the global stocktake truly effective as a moment of reckoning for the international community is that it should identify opportunities for states and non-state actors, for multiple stakeholders to take practical, scalable options to collectively meet these updated benchmarks that we're talking about, which then will tell us how environmentally effective this entire regime is. The global stocktake could, in this context, identify opportunities for enhanced mitigation, perhaps at the sectoral level, as Dean and others have already indicated, identify opportunities for more tailored finance, especially in relation to just transitions in developing countries, but more generally, both in relation to ambition and implementation, since both of these will transcend state-led action. The global stocktake should act as a bridge between the UN process and the wider community of actors and stakeholders who will shape and implement policy, what I've heard champions characterize as multi-stakeholder multilateralism. And that's the direction the global stocktake will need to go in to actually function as a true moment of reckoning for the international community on climate change. Thank you, Kaveh.
Thanks a lot, Lavanya. And just at the risk of ruining our friendship, I'm going to ask you something I hadn't warned you about. I mean, there's an issue that's very close to your heart, is the issue of equity, and you mentioned that as being an important part of the stocktake, and it's actually in the mandate of the stocktake, both in terms of the Paris Agreement and the decision, if I remember correctly. Do you think it's interesting that we heard this week, actually yesterday, Prime Minister Modi of India announced net zero by 2070. We've heard China net zero by 2060, and of course all of the G7 and a number of other countries by 2050 or earlier. Do you think those differences in the end point of reaching net zero emissions, is that the beginning of implementing or attempting to implement equity, make it operational?
Thank you, Kaveh. No, it's not a question that risks our friendship. It's a question that I've thought about, and it's a question that I have some views on. Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement very clearly expects and recognizes that peaking will happen later in developing countries. And in fact, the entire tenor and tone and terms of Article 4.1 expects differentiated net zero. Net zero will be reached or should be reached by different countries. There's an expectation that it'll be reached by different countries at different timescales depending on national circumstances and other constraints. The logical conclusion to draw from that is that other countries, developed countries, will need to get to net zero sooner than mid-century to create room for developing countries that need that extra space and that extra time to get to net zero. So there is a sharing of the net zero burden to get to net zero by mid-century. And I think the variation that we're seeing in timeframes for getting to net zero is a reflection of that. Whether 2070 for India or 2060 for another country is the appropriate level of differentiation is not something that we have, in our wisdom, decided is going to be a multilaterally negotiated burden sharing arrangement on net zero. But the fact that there's differentiated timescales is, I think, a beginning, and a recognition that there should be differentiated timescales for getting to net zero is a beginning of that conversation on whether other countries that have the ability to do so should do so sooner to create that space for these countries to get there later.
Back to at the time of Paris, where we were told it was impossible to reach net zero by mid-century, and now we have, I think, some 90% of world GDP covered by net zero commitments, which is pretty remarkable. So we started off in California, and we came to Glasgow, and then we went to Oxford, and now I'm going to take the liberty of introducing Kelly Keziah, who's in one of my favorite places in the world, in Colorado. Kelly is the Vice President at EDF, who we're working very closely with the GST project. And Kelly, I would really appreciate if you could tell us a little bit about the project that we're working on and what we're planning to do, taking on board some of these ideas that you've heard today. Kelly.
Thanks, Kaveh, and thanks to the amazing panel for sharing their views on the ways in which we can make the global stocktake a success. I mean, there's obviously a lot of work ahead, but I'm delighted to be here today, even though it's only remotely. I'm actually flying to Glasgow tomorrow, so we're just one day early. Indeed, I want to take a little time to tell everyone a little bit more about our global stocktake project. So C2ES and EDF, with support from Quadrature Climate Foundation, are undertaking a joint initiative to help shape the global stocktake. The aim of the joint effort is to make sure that the global stocktake makes a real contribution to ambition under the Paris Agreement, and to ensure that it's not just another box-ticking exercise. I think there's a real risk of that, and all of us that have been involved in the negotiations understand that all too well. I think in the end, what we want is the cohesive, comprehensive, and relevant process that Lavanya spoke to on the back of the comments by Dean and Kishan. In order for the global stocktake to be an integral part of the Paris Agreement's ambition cycle, we need to bring the work of the UNFCCC to the real economy in some sense. So this year in the project, we're focusing our attention on identifying from the amazing work of many others, the near-term scalable actions that, one, are aligned with the Paris Agreement's long-term goals, and two, that can be advanced in the context of the global stocktake. In the next stage and throughout the lead up to the first GST in 2023, we'll engage governments, experts, and key stakeholders to build support for an opportunities framework. So focusing on opportunities to facilitate inputs into and outputs from that first GST. I think the focus of our engagement strategy will also be to help mobilize the political will that we heard Kishan speak about. I mean, I think that's the key. And we want to do that by maintaining a strong focus on opportunities to scale up climate ambition across mitigation, adaptation, and finance. We're keenly aware of connections and the need to maintain balance there, instead of only a focus on the burdens imposed by necessary climate action. I think we're going to need to take into account many of the issues we've heard about today. So Kate mentioned the importance of focusing on implementation, which is absolutely key, not only for the policy commitments, but for investment and for the deployment of the key technologies. We also need to find a way to maintain focus on those key sectors ripe for action. I think Dean mentioned many of the most promising candidates, but also to find a way to fill the information gaps for the other sectors. And I think Kate spoke to that. We absolutely need to connect this to the Paris framework, the need for transparency and robust accountability throughout, as well as the important role of non-state actors, the importance of innovation, and the key role of equity. All of this we have to undertake given the limitations of a global stocktake in the context of the UNFCCC process. That's just the process we're involved in, but we need to make sure that it has a real result. Even though our focus will be on the GST and the Paris Agreement, we want to design it so it can have impact through broader collective effort outside the UNFCCC, so that it can impact real world dynamics. And I need to say, we're not trying to duplicate the efforts of others, so many amazing efforts, which are identifying not only where we are, but also the key pathways to get to where we want to be. I can't name them all today, but we've heard about a lot of the important ones. Instead, we're looking to take from those a set of opportunities and interventions that provide the most promise for taking forward in the context of the global stocktake, including in the context of those limitations that we've all heard about today. The aim is for this opportunities framework that we're creating to bring the pathways, innovation, and the interventions that we need to decision makers directly in the context of the global stocktake, so that they can focus on the opportunities and not only the burdens of climate action, and so that they're better equipped to progress ambition through the ambition cycle. So no small ask, but we're really engaged on this and want to make sure that the global stocktake is a success. So in that context, we look forward to engaging with many of you again over the course of the COP, but also over the course of the project. And we certainly welcome all of your input in the coming weeks and months. Thanks, Kaveh.
Thanks a lot for joining us, and I'm willing to bet that it's sunnier there in Denver than it is here in Glasgow during the day. You should bring some of that sunshine when you arrive tomorrow. Thanks a lot. Well, I'm not going to attempt to summarize, but a brief reflection. I mean, I think some of the key things that I've heard coming through today is that things have evolved enormously since Paris, which seems like only yesterday. But since that time, as I say, we've had the G7 committing to net zero by 2050, including President Biden even yesterday published the US's plan on pathways to achieving that. We've seen exponential growth in opportunities, and some of the key words I'm hearing is really that focus on implementation and opportunity, and that transition from the negotiating mode in the UNFCCC to do that. And the global stocktake seems to be the place where all of that can come together. And on top of that, the climate champions that have done tremendous work in bringing that non-party stakeholder focus into the UNFCCC process in a way that really hasn't been done before. I mean, walking around the action agenda here in Glasgow, it's really impressive to see that. So watch this space on the global stocktake. CTUS and EDF have a website. We'll keep you updated, and it's a 3-year project we're working on, and I'm definitely going to be involving all of our speakers today in that. So thank you very much to Kate from Rhodium in California there, Kishan and other negotiators, Dean from the Champions team. Thank you very much for joining us. I know it's you've had to leave a busy agenda and you have to get back to that. And thank you also to Lavanya and Kelly. And last but not least, thank you very much to the US Centre for hosting us here in Glasgow. Thank you very much and goodbye. Thank you.